Let's get to Eamon, because Ukraine's president and a group of European leaders are planning to meet President Trump at the White House today, following that meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. And Eamon Javers, as I mentioned, is with us. Hey, Eamon.
Yeah, good morning to you, Joe. As you say, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy is expected at the White House later today to help chart a path forward in the wake of those failed talks between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. Also present will be leaders of 5 European countries who are part of the so-called coalition of the willing that's backing Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Sources told NBC News over the weekend that President Trump engaged with President Zelenskyy and European leaders by phone early Saturday morning about the U.S. being a party to a potential NATO-like security guarantee for Ukraine as part of a deal struck with Russia. Now, such security guarantees have been a key demand of the Ukrainians as part of any deal to end the fighting. Secretary of State Marco Rubio explained the latest thinking on Meet the Press yesterday.
One of their fundamental demands is that if this war were to end, they have to make sure this never happens again. They don't want to get reinvaded. They don't want to wait 3 or 4 years from now and find another, war on their hands. So there's going to have to be some security guarantees as part of it. How that's structured, how that's built, what our role will be, that'll be the kinds of things we'll have to work through.
And take a look at the list of European attendees at the White House today. Alexander Stubb, President of Finland; Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany; Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission; Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General; and Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK; Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy; Emmanuel Macron of France. A long list of European leaders at the White House today. And the question for all these leaders today, guys, is if they can craft a NATO-like security guarantees for Ukraine that are enough like NATO to reassure the Ukrainians that they're real, and yet not so much like NATO that they're a non-starter for the Russian side. It's going to be a challenge. Back over to you.
Yes, certainly is. And we just got to wait, obviously, to know how it's received. I think there's... I don't know. Where do you think the Europeans come down? They've obviously they're a lot closer to Russia and have a lot more, I guess, that they're concerned about. Do you think they'll be less hesitant to tell Zelenskyy to maybe consider, permanently giving up some territory? I don't know what to think of what they're going to be telling Zelenskyy versus what President Trump is going to be trying to orchestrate.
I mean, I think in broad strokes, you could say that the Europeans generally, Macron in particular, are a little bit more pro-Kyiv and wary of Trump's diplomacy with Vladimir Putin. They don't want the U.S. to get drawn into a situation where we're pushing the Ukrainian side to concede too much. I think the Europeans do want an end to the war, but also want an end on Ukrainian terms. And I think they're wary of another blow-up in the Oval Office, the way we saw earlier this year with Zelenskyy and President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. This will be the first time he's been in the Oval Office since that dramatic confrontation. The tone, I think, will be much different today, but we'll see. I mean, President Trump was very respectful coming out of his meeting with Putin, saying, one of the first people I want to talk to is Zelenskyy. And you've seen the Zelenskyy tweets over the weekend. He's been very respectful of Trump, saying, he's grateful for Trump, grateful for the American people, trying to be very ginger about this relationship, which really fractured earlier this year, and it's so important for both countries.
Eamon, I think the big question, though, is what does Putin give up in this? We've seen the concessions that we've asked for and what President Trump offered just in terms of this. These assurances, these security assurances are certainly different than he'd been offering in the past. But what about Putin? What does he give up? Because he's asking for the entire Donbas region, which the Russians have been trying to take control of militarily since 2014 and have not been successful.
Yeah, and, he might want more than that even. You heard Marco Rubio say it in that clip, right? I mean, the idea is if you're Ukraine, any kind of ceasefire can be potentially dangerous in the sense that it could just give the Russians time to rearm, replenish their supplies, their personnel, and mount another offensive in a year or two. And that's not where they want to be. They want to end this thing, and so that's why they want these security guarantees. The question is, what are the security guarantees exactly? Does that mean, NATO forces could be drawn into a war with Russia in a year's time. That's not something I think anyone in NATO wants. It's not something the U.S. certainly wants, and it's potentially very dangerous in terms of global confrontation. So how do you construct security guarantees that don't draw NATO into armed conflict, but are strong enough to deter the Russians, and at the same time don't give the Russians their biggest fear, which is NATO on their doorstep in Ukraine? That's the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things that the Russians have objected to all along, is the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to their frontier. They want to push back and have a buffer zone in Ukraine that's not NATO territory. So that's all just very tricky to work through. That's part of why this war has been so contentious, and that's what the leaders are going to have to contend with today in a drama-filled moment just after the Putin meeting, on the heels of that Zelenskyy breakup at the White House, President Trump orchestrating it all today. It's going to be something to see.
And we've heard so many times that, Putin considers troops like pawns, and doesn't, civilians too. It's been a horrific thing to watch over the past couple of years. Does anything matter to him? And people say the economy, I guess, at some point does matter, yeah. and that's the only thing he understands. But is that true? When we talk about China, a lot of times we say, well, they don't even care if the people continue to suffer and not having everything, not coming up to the living standards of the rest of the world. You wonder whether the CCP worries or really cares about that. And I wonder, is that something that speaks to Putin?
Yeah, if you look at Russian history, obviously they have an enormous history of economic deprivation and the ability to tolerate that for decades on end. But there is a limit to Russia's economic ability to carry on this war, and the question is, it may be unknowable. I'm sure U.S. intelligence has an estimate. How much longer can Russia really finance this operation, given that the sanctions, they've been very clever in getting around them and continuing economic activity, but at some point they won't be able to have the sort of economic throw weight to continue to carry this on. And where is that point, and what can the U.S. do to hasten that? You look at the war in Afghanistan for the Russians in the 80s, that did had a devastating economic effect on the Soviet Union at that time. Right. A generation of soldiers lost, and an economic breaking point for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The losses here have been more severe, dramatically more severe than they have been there, and the expense here is much more. So, at some point, you're looking at an economic breaking point. Where that is and what the Russian public is willing to tolerate, what Putin himself is willing to tolerate, all of that's kind of unknowable.
Lavrov with the CCCP shirt on. Confusing, yeah. Isn't it? There's the CCP, subtle. And then there's the so the communists. That's the Cyrillic abbreviation for USSR, I guess. CCC.
Yeah, there is not the CCCP, but some people want to bring it back.
Yeah, exactly. And then you got the other CCP, which is also a thorn in our side sometimes.